Hi, hello, welcome or welcome back. I hope you're doing well. I am filming today from the very unexciting locale of my office slash guest bedroom. That is a bed frame in the background. But I wanted to just film some kind of quick and casual reflections on my reads in January. I recently posted a tier ranking of all the books I read in 2024, and while those annual reflections can be really fun, like a really cool way to see kind of the highs and lows of the year, they can also be challenging, especially for reads that were kind of middle of the road, not new favorites, not new least favorites, and especially for those books that I read towards the beginning of the year, to even remember what my thoughts were. I'm trying to get better at writing Goodreads reviews, so I at least have some form of record of my experience. But I also want to start doing these kind of monthly wrap-ups, especially for months where I've read, more than one or two books, because I don't know that it's worth it at that point, but I read 7 books this month, 5 books, 1 short story, and 1 novella, if we want to be really accurate. So going in order of when I read them, the first thing I read this year was a short story called The Tiger Came to the Mountains by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This short story is set in Mexico in 1917. It's a story about a young girl and her brother surviving in the midst of a revolution. This is part of the Trespass collection of short stories. So I mentioned that last year I read the Into Darkness collection of short stories, and this is the only one I've read in the Trespass collection. I just kind of put it down and didn't pick it back up, but I'd like to finish them. Short stories can be a really great way of kind of feeling an author out and discovering new authors that you might really enjoy. This is the second short story I have read. Oh, my cat is here. This is the second short story I've read by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and I've felt pretty middle of the road about both of them, and I have a hard time putting my finger on why. I don't think I have an easy time connecting to her characters, and short stories can be difficult. You're not given much time to connect with the characters, so that is just kind of an inherent challenge. I would be somewhat interested in reading a novel of hers, but I can't say she's at the top of my list for authors I'd like to read more from. The second book I read this year was The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I don't know why this ended up, so I have a short list of young adult books that I would still like to read. One of my big projects last year was going through my Goodreads to read shelf and clearing out a lot of the old books that I had added when I was like 14 and I was no longer interested in as an adult. And I'm not quite sure how or why, but The Inheritance Games made the cut. But regardless of how or why, it remained on my list. I got the audiobook of it at the beginning of the year and listened to it, and I had a bad time. The Inheritance Games is about a young woman named Avery who is down on her luck. She has very little money to her name. She has no parents. She I don't know if she's technically an orphan, because I think there's a twist about her dad at the end that I've already forgotten. But her mom is dead, and she lives with her older sister, and she's just trying to make it out of high school, get a scholarship, go to college, and start her life. Understandable. One day, a billionaire that she has never heard of dies and includes her in his inheritance for reasons unknown to everyone, including his family. And so she goes to the estate to hear the reading of the will, and it turns out that almost the entire inheritance has been left to her. Now, the family is obviously very upset about this. The condition is that she has to live in this estate for a year to receive the money. And she's like, okay. There ends up being like puzzles and a mystery. The man who died had 4 grandsons, the Hawthorne brothers, 2 of whom are immediately and very obviously set up as love interests in this love triangle. And I think I'm just too old for books like this. I think it's mostly a me problem, but I did not like this. My Goodreads review, which if you want, you can come be my friend on Goodreads, said, imagine Knives Out, but significantly worse, featuring supposedly likable characters such as drunk 17-year-old boy who would waste his dying breath on a double entendre, and best friend who can't curse and therefore says gems like son of a beach and he looks faxable every other sentence. The only character I liked was a dollar store Declan Lynch, which just made me wish I was reading those books instead. I think when a book is just bad, I have an easier time accepting that. But when it has potential that then is squandered, I get angry. And this book was frustrating because I think it has potential but fell short. Also, one of the problems here is that the main character is set up as so smart, so good at solving puzzles, so strategically minded. And writing a character like that is difficult because you actually have to fulfill what you've promised your reader. And unfortunately, following Avery as she is solving these puzzles, I never really felt like, oh, she's so far ahead of me. I mean, there's a balance there, right? Because you don't want your characters coming to conclusions that your reader never would, because that feels unrelatable. But also, it's a bad thing if your reader is like ahead of the character who you're being told is smart. So, yeah, this one just wasn't for me. I won't be continuing the series. I think there's like 5 books and they all came out within a few year span. So, yeah, I guess the buzz just kind of lied to me and I should have taken this off of my short list of YAs I still want to read. The next book I read was Ink and Bone by Rachel Kane. I don't really see this book anywhere. It has been on my TBR for a very long time. So I mentioned that I cleaned up my TBR last year, and I'm starting to go back and read the books that have been on there the longest. And Ink and Bone bears the dubious honor of being the oldest book on my TBR. Not oldest in terms of when it was published, but as in it's been sitting on my TBR the longest, aside from all the books I deleted last year that I no longer want to read. The premise is that the Library of Alexandria never burned and became kind of like a Vatican-esque world power, and it controls the world's flow of information. So in this world, you're not allowed to own a physical original copy of a book. You're only allowed to own, I think they're called blanks, which are copies from the library's archives. This is a world where magic exists, so there's like magic that kind of this system relies on. The main character is named Jess Brightwell, and he is the son of a book smuggler. And as he grows up, he develops this deep love for reading and for learning. And his father realizes, like, you have no mind for business. You're clearly not going to take over this operation from me. We'll leave that to your brother. I'm going to send you to study at the library and become a scholar. And so he goes and studies to become a scholar. It's really it's not a perfect book by any means. The prose is sometimes a little bit confusing. There were a couple times that I caught the characters knowing things that they shouldn't, but I think the concepts are interesting enough that I want to keep reading. And I do find it kind of funny that the Atlas 6 has a similar core idea and does, in my opinion, such a poor job at really exploring what the world would look like if the Library of Alexandria had survived. Whereas this book, I think it does some really fascinating and plausible things with what the world would look like. Because we often think of, like, the way we tend to talk about the Library of Alexandria is, man, wouldn't the world be such a better place if this vast body of knowledge had not been destroyed and humanity had been able to continue building on it and advancing it? But what's interesting about Ink and Bone is it's kind of inverting that question and saying, what if the world was kind of worse off? Like, yes, the knowledge survived, but the Library of Alexandria was a tool of the empire and in some ways was a place for free learning. But what if it continued to govern the flow of information in a way that we don't really think about in the modern day? Another thing that's kind of interesting about, the author speculating on how history would develop if this library had stayed intact is that we get these, they're called ephemera, these snippets of writing from people throughout history. And so very close to the beginning of the book, there's a snippet of writing from Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press. This is a world where the printing press does not exist. And it's kind of fascinating because people keep inventing the printing press and the library keeps suppressing this knowledge because it is almost like well, not almost, I think this language is used in the book. It's like heretical to suggest that writings should be reproduced in this way that is so unregulated. It also strikes me as being a little bit in the vein of Babel as well, because it's asking these questions about knowledge, power, and empire. And I don't have developed thoughts on that yet, but I think as I read further into the series, I think what interests me is that the author has introduced complex questions to which there are no easy answers, but it feels like she's aware of that, right? And I'm curious to see how she fleshes them out as we move forward. I also really did care about the characters. Like I said, Jess goes to school to study, and he's in this class of other students, and so you get to know them and kind of their different specialties and dispositions and the way they relate to one another and kind of the web of relationships they build with one another. You can tell which ones are disposable, like maybe aren't gonna make it to the end of the book, and which ones aren't. But overall, I thought the characters were really well handled. One of my main complaints was that there was a sudden romance that kind of shouldered a lot of the emotional weight of the last third of the book in a way that it didn't feel like it was ready to do yet. I understand that they're like teens, and so you do develop feelings very quickly when you're 17, 18 years old. I get that. But I didn't really appreciate it in the context of this story. So yeah, I was really surprised by how much I liked this book, taken off guard in a good way, and I look forward to continuing the series. The next book I read was The Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. I really expected to love this book because it has all of these parts that on paper should be just chef's kiss perfect. It is a gothic novel. It's set in a creepy, sort of sentient old house. There's very dreamy magic. There's a component of like a historical mystery that the characters are trying to piece together. There are elements of examining like class and race and misogyny and how those overlap with kind of the magical situation going on. It's set in a small town, and there's a lot of individual relationships that are built up throughout the story that come to be kind of a ragtag found family that feels very earned. And there is a romance. There's like a romance at the center of it between the man who lives in the house and the woman who starts, I guess I didn't actually give the plot itself. This woman starts cleaning this creepy house in her town because it for years has called to her in dreams. She feels like she belongs there. And so she shows up one day and is like, I think you need a housekeeper. And the man living there is like, I guess, okay. And it turns out that he is the warden of the Starling House, because from this house, when the fog rises, or when the mist rises, I think is the term in the book, these otherworldly monsters appear. And they appear from within the house, and if they're not stopped, they'll go out into the town and kill people. And so he has a sword, and he's the warden, and he hunts down these creatures when they get out. And the two main characters that there's a romance between, they're very, like, disagreeable people, which I think is kind of fun. Like, I think it's probably easy for authors to want to write, like, two nice, pretty people falling in love. Like, that's very pleasant and idealized. But these characters are described very, like, physically realistically, for one thing, which I really like. And also, yeah, just, like, kind of unpleasant people in their own ways, but also very likable. And that's how humans are. So as I'm explaining this all, it sounds pretty great, right? But there just was something that didn't click for me. I think the story dragged a bit, for one thing, especially kind of piecing together the mystery. It felt like we should have had more forward momentum on that. And then I don't know, there just was something that didn't quite work that I can't put my finger on, but I have seen other reviews express the same sentiment, so I know I'm not alone in this. Alex E. Harrow, the author of The Starling House, also wrote The Six Deaths of the Saint, which was one of my favorites of 2024, a really wonderful short story. So this was me trying to explore more of her writing. I would still be interested in reading some of her other work. I think the 10,000 Doors of January, is that what it's called, is a book by her as well that I might look into and try to read too. She's a very talented author. There was something about this book that didn't quite click. Also, I don't know if this is specific to me, but after finishing reading this book, I was like, was Alex E. Harrow a Raylo fanfic writer? I had to go Google. I couldn't find anything. So I don't think she was. But a lot of authors today got their start in fanfiction, which is fine. I'm not saying that's a problem. But there's been especially a rise of published authors that started in Raylo fanfic specifically, and I think it is just the description of the two main characters in this novel, and then I saw a specific fan art for these characters, and I was like, is that Kylo Ren? But that was just a me hunch, and I found nothing to back it up, so I think I'm imagining things, but anyways, The Starling House, those are my thoughts. Next, I read Thornhdege by T. Kingfisher. I own this it's a little, I think technically a novella. It's shorter. T. Kingfisher is one of those authors that I will read anything she writes. She's kind of a comfort author for me though, so I'll space them out. I think it's Paladin's Grace. I have the audiobook ready in Libby for me to check out, but I keep pushing it back because it's I just save her for when I really need a comfort read. Thornhdege is a Sleeping Beauty retelling. It follows a character named Toadling, who was born human but raised by fairies, so she's kind of neither. She has some magic, but she's not fully fairy. She's called Toadling because she can transform into a toad, and she spends a lot of time in her toad form. And she is guarding the tower where the Sleeping Beauty of this story is sleeping. And it's Toadling's magic that has wrapped the tower in briars and that has kept the princess asleep. And one day a knight shows up and he's heard the legends of this princess who's in perpetual sleep. And he's just kind of interested in it as a story. He wants to know if it's true, but it's not really a heroic, I'm here to save the princess and get a wife. That's not what it's about. And Toadling is very distressed by him arriving because she was really hoping that everyone forgot that there used to be a castle here and that there used to be a princess. It's been centuries. This is very fun. It is a delightful little romp. Toadling is very anxious. She's very fretful. She has these lovely little memories of her upbringing in fairy. She was raised by monsters basically, but to her they're her family, and so she thinks about her standards of what is beautiful and what is loving and what is comforting and what is home is based on how she was raised by these sharp-toothed, vicious little monsters that took her in as their own. And it's really, really precious. It's really well done. I will say, with fairy tale retellings, there's only so many ways you can retell a story, and so I did guess where we were going. I guessed kind of the, why is the princess in the tower? Why is she locked up? Why is Toadling the one who locked her up? You figure out those pieces, but the journey itself is enjoyable, and so it didn't really matter that I knew where it was going because I was just having a fun time along the way. The next book I read is called Rock and Sand. I mentioned in my 2024 tier ranking that I am Orthodox, and I try to be reading a book related to Orthodoxy at all times. I just kind of slowly make my way through them. I have no interest in proselytizing via YouTube, so it's fine if you're not Orthodox, but it is a part of my life and part of what I read throughout the year. So this book is an Orthodox perspective on the Protestant reformers and their teachings. I was raised Protestant and became Orthodox as an adult, and it is a big shift. There are some huge differences between Protestantism, which is even an umbrella term. There's a lot of teachings under that differ from one another, and Orthodoxy. And so it's helpful to have those laid out Helpful to have historical background as well, because I was raised in the US. I am shaped, for better or for worse, by Western religious and intellectual developments and movements. And the Orthodox Church it's called the Eastern Orthodox Church because historically it spread more in the eastern part of the world because of the Great Schism. There's just a bunch of history there. But the way that the church even thinks about things is different. The questions people ask are different. And it's really interesting and challenging, but in a good way, to try to adjust to some of those things. One thing that was kind of interesting is I really didn't realize how political the Reformation was, that the reformers were very willing to ally themselves with political powers that, I don't know, I think sometimes the Reformation gets taught as this like pure religious movement against the Catholic Church and against corruption, and in reality these movements were very corrupted in their own ways too. So an interesting and helpful read for me. Speaking of corruption in religious movements, the last book I read this month was Counting the Cost by Jill Duggar. I've been following coverage of the the Institute for Basic Life Principles. I just take for granted these acronyms. I've been following kind of coverage of that movement and similar movements for a while. I watched Shiny Happy People when it came out, as well as different YouTube coverage of Shiny Happy People as well. So Fundy Fridays, Jordan and McKay also released some content related to Shiny Happy People. Did I say Happy Shiny People? Shiny Happy People. I was not part of a family who was interested in, nor did I really have any personal interest in watching shows like 19 Kids and Counting, or those like TLC shows that followed different religious families. I never had much interest in that, and so it's only as an adult that I've really learned about these things. I didn't know what the IBLP was until I was an adult, and so I had Counting the Cost on my TBR since it came out, and I just finally got around to reading it. The audiobook is voiced by Jill Duggar. She does a really wonderful job. You can hear her get emotional at moments, and I'm really proud of her for sharing her story. I think she's in such a unique position where not only was she abused, not only did she suffer under these systems, but her life was so publicized that in some ways her story was not really her own for most of her life, right? And it's really powerful to see her reclaiming her story, making it her own, sharing it in her own words. And one thing that I wrote in my Goodreads review is that I think we would do well to honor the boundaries that she sets around her own story. So she doesn't go into much detail about the abuse she suffered under her brother, for example. And I think that that is space we should allow her to have, right? I think sometimes we feel so entitled to the intimate details of people's lives, especially if they're public figures. But we need to remember they're real people, especially in situations like this where she was a minor and a victim of abuse. And so, the media storms surrounding Josh Duggar's trials, she talks about how re-traumatizing that was for her and how it always ignited this resurgence of invasiveness into her life and into her suffering. And so I think we really should make an effort to honor and protect the victims in situations like this. There were parts of Counting the Cost that I felt uncomfortable with, especially, and I wrote about this in my Goodreads review as well, the way she talks about missions work is very unexamined. I don't know that that's a good way to put it, but I understand that, like, in evangelical circles, missions get talked about as inherently positive, but in reality, what we know is that there's a lot of white saviorism, a lot of paternalism that happens in these mission circles. And sometimes the way she talked about the missions work that she and her husband did felt very depersonalized. She talked very little about connecting with people, making genuine relationships. She also talked very little about like what work they did. What she talked a lot about were her safety concerns in El Salvador and how they had to hire a guard. And while I'm sure that like those concerns would affect you if you lived there, right? But the overall effect made it feel depersonalized and a bit self-serving too. El Salvador is like 80% Catholic. So I just don't. So I was kind of side-eyeing any part of the book that had to do with that, even though I understand that moving to a different country was a big part of her kind of detaching and finding freedom from her family and from TLC. So I understand that on a personal level, but like I said, it felt very unexamined. So that would be my main critique of the book. But overall, I am really, like I said, really proud of her for sharing her story. And I think there is a lot to be learned, even for those of us who didn't grow up in IBLP, are very distant from it. There's a lot to be learned from paying attention to stories like this, especially about like our media landscape and the way we exploit people, especially children, for our own entertainment. Many lessons to be learned on YouTube as well. So those were the 7 books, or 5 books, 1 short story, 1 novella, my 7 reads of January. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them. If you had a new favorite read this month, feel free to recommend it below. And like I said, I hope you are well, and I will see you again when I see you again. Bye.